I expect a lot of you are like me and are really into maps. Maybe since childhood, maybe long after you grew up and it stopped being cute. Maybe. Well, today's conversation is for you. I've wanted to do more on mapping and the visualization of space in military affairs and geopolitics since we started the show. But for obvious reasons, that's been a challenge on a podcast that's been largely audio only since its inception. By the way, there's some news coming on that front, so stay tuned. But today I get to talk maps with two really smart professors in the Army's professional military education system and their work on how to improve how we visualize battles and campaigns of the past and of the future. Let's get into it.
It is a prescription for war, this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
We continue to face the grave situation in Iran.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender.
For more, follow School of War on YouTube, Instagram, Substack, and Twitter. And feel free to follow me on Twitter at Aaron B. McLean. Hi, I'm Aaron McLean. Thanks for joining School of War. I am delighted to welcome to the show today Tom Bruscino, who is a historian and professor in the Department of Military Strategy, Planning, and Operations at the U.S. Army War College, and Mitchell Klingenberg, a historian and assistant professor in the Department of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Both military historians, both serious scholars and authors of many things, and most recently, a really fascinating article, Making War on the Map, about mapping and operational art and operational decision-making as seen through the lens of the Gettysburg campaign. Guys, I really enjoyed it, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having us.
Good to be here, Aaron. Thanks for having us.
So I'll toss this first question out, and either one of you who wants to take it on, or both, feel free. I have at home the West Point 2-volume atlas. It's an old version. I think I had already been in the Marines for a while, and it wasn't part of our curriculum in any way at Quantico, and I'm pretty sure I was in a used bookstore at some point when I was an officer, and I saw this. I don't know when it was printed. I'm on the road right now, so I can't take it down off the shelf, but probably sometime in the 80s, judging by sort of glance at my visual memory of it. And it's just this magnificent document that has taught me a lot over the years. And it's a great quick reference, if you want to learn what was going on, in 1943 on the Eastern Front or something like that. There's just a few pages right there. You turn to them really quickly and it gives you an overview, a quick narrative, and a great visualization. The upshot of your article, though, is that these maps and others like them leave a lot to be desired. So I'll start us there. What in these traditional maps that have been used in officer education for a very long time, what's missing?
So, this is Tom. We should start by saying we don't speak for the Army, Department of Defense, or the United States government. We're here. We work there, but we don't speak for them. So this is all our personal views on these matters. When it comes to the West Point maps, we should start by saying we're fans. Mitchell taught in the West Point History Department, and they've used them for a long time. They're online. We highly recommend people use them. Like you said, they're a great reference, but they provide a broad overview. One of the stories we tell in this article is about how they came to be, and they were derived out of a teaching material that an instructor at Leavenworth used in the early 1900s named Matthew Steele for a course, and he developed maps to talk about American campaigns in a course called The Conduct of War. And at the time, the map making capabilities were pretty limited at Schoolhouse and even in the War Department. So they kind of borrowed from a lot of more popular accounts. So he did it for a bunch of them. When it came to the Civil War, he pulled a lot of them from the Campaigns and Leaders, Civil War stuff. So, they kind of came out of these popular maps and they could only do so much with them. And even Steele said these are kind of limited. And then eventually Steele's book was adopted, and the atlases that accompanied it was adopted at the West Point History Department for their courses. And then they made their own. The ones you saw were this later ones, a guy named Vincent Esposito sort of put them together, but didn't really improve on the sort of campaigning portion of it. Really looking at it from the perspective of the field army commanders and how they looked at their fights. They're great for battles. They tend to be a little bit weaker on campaigns. They're not showing everything. Mitchell, continue if you would like about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great overview, Tom. And I think we should note too that at one point the operational level narrative of the campaigns that accompanied the atlases was dropped. And this happened sometime around the turn of the millennium, I think in 2002, when course offerings at USMA and in the Department of History kind of expanded beyond the traditional operational level of warfare and the tactical level of warfare to include wider political, maybe grand strategic, these kinds of considerations. So I echo Tom's point wholesale. The maps are great for what they show, and we were really trying to take the, what those show one step farther.
So one of the things I really liked about your piece was how it lingers on just the role that visualization plays for commanders. And it's in a way, it's like a basic observation. And another way to understand it is to kind of understand the whole thing. Everyone in any kind of spatial competition that I was about to say that goes beyond like the size of a tennis court, but even there you have to envision the future. So everyone is always picturing scenarios in a very literal way, like they are imagining what things look like in order to make decisions and shape the future. What specifically is it that these sort of traditional, or the traditional American way of military mapping leaves out and makes it therefore harder to visualize for commanders?
Yeah, so we should be specific about this. That when we talk about it, that and it's really a problem across the board. There's really no maps that do this particularly well, and I would say it's a problem of modern industrialized warfare, in particular. So the previous maps, and this is both on a historical side and then for the use of commanders, as warfare changed, as its scale grew, as it became more complicated, more technologies involved, all of these things. We didn't catch up with how a commander visualizes it at echelon or at scale, right? So we're the entire Defense Department is in this kind of effort to try to figure out how to do warfighting better, and what does it mean? And one of the things we're sort of emphasizing here is that this is warfighting at a particular level, and we haven't really sort of thought about. I think we've done a pretty good job with battles about what a way a commander would visualize a battle in maps. You sort of see that, and those have held up pretty well. A lot of those are just, sketches and can be done pretty quickly, but we haven't done it so well for campaigning itself, for a larger scale campaigning. What a field army commander is actually thinking about. That's the particular level we're working on in this. It could be a joint task force commander. It could be a fleet commander. What is it? How do they visualize their battle space? What used to be called maybe a theater of operations. Now it's often called a joint operational area or something like that. So that understanding is what we're talking about. And so, what the phrase we use is that what we've tended to do is have pumped up battle maps, so they looks like a battle just on a bigger scale. And then what ends up happening is as you kind of scale out to try to capture all the things they're looking at, the roads drop off of it, the bases of supply drop off of it, the lines of operation, the scale of the units on the road and their movements, all that stuff is missing from it. And all of these other sort of auxiliary headquarters that really matter to the field army commander, but don't seem to be on the maps that depict what that in this case, George Gordon Meade was visualizing. But it could be Ulysses S. Grant, it could be Dwight Eisenhower, it could be John Pershing, you name it. And across the world, any campaign, it's not really what they're thinking about. It's what, we've kind of, so it tends to be these kind of base units, corps kind of floating around, there's no road, right? So they're just kind of in this general space. Sometimes there's rivers, not really railroads. We don't show ports. There's a lot of this stuff ends up missing from this. And we use Gettysburg because it was pretty straightforward, pretty familiar for a lot of people. But then you could really see how much stuff went into how Meade thought about it. And you could do this for all. We meant this just as a kind of a cue to hopefully get people thinking this way.
Let's leap into Meade in the days leading up to Gettysburg. We've never talked about Gettysburg on the show here. We're not really going to talk about the battle itself today. Maybe we should devote an episode to that some other time. But the days leading up to it, which should illustrate your point of what's on the mind of a field army commander, but not actually depicted on virtually any of the maps that show the action of these days. Tell us how George Meade saw the world on. Was it 28 June that he takes over 1863? What is the situation? What is he dealing with?
Yeah, so I'll field this one, I suppose. Meade takes command on the 28th, right? He's woken in the night by the bearer of the dispatch, the order basically appointing him to command of the Army of the Potomac. He is fearful, thinks he's going to be basically arrested, but is informed that he's replacing General Hooker as commander of the Army of the Potomac. And really his first order of business is to figure out where his corps headquarters are to get a better sight picture of where the enemy are. and basically to understand all available intelligence to him, to understand the strategic guidance he receives, which is that he has to cover Washington and Baltimore, be prepared to defend those, what Clausewitz or Jomini might have called decisive points or objectives, and also be prepared to either defend against the Army of Northern Virginia or to pursue it and try to destroy it in detail. And this is all confronting him on the 28th of June. As many listeners probably know, the first day of the battle is 1 July. So flash to bang for General Meade is a very short time horizon. It's a very short timeline. But I would say those are the broad generalities, Aaron, right? Like first he has to understand and comprehend the strategic guidance that he's received. He has to understand what pieces he has at his disposal, which are a handful of infantry corps, a cavalry corps. The artillery of the Army of the Potomac has been kind of distributed at corps, but also there's a reserve element as well. And so he has to figure out all of this and the best location for his base of operations and plan a campaign on really short notice.
And then I guess, critically, he also has to figure out what the heck the bad guys are up to and Lee's decisions. And that becomes this interplay between his assumptions about Confederate objectives, but then also his knowledge of terrain, which is going to dictate the options of the Confederates, right? How does the understanding of the enemy situation start to play out?
So this is one thing we did, so military historians argue about this, and certainly in the military schoolhouse, we kind of argue about whether we should tell the story of a campaign from both sides simultaneously. But it's very hard to evaluate a commander that way. It's kind of unfair. Meade doesn't know what Lee's actually doing. He knows what his intelligence is telling him Meade is doing, and his ability to sort of put himself in Lee's shoes and visualize and guess what he would do against the terrain based on the intel he has about where he is at any time. So we do tell this pretty exclusively from Meade's side, and we do that deliberately. And I think that is a good way. I think it's the only way you can sort of fairly evaluate a commander. You can't judge him for not knowing things that he couldn't possibly know. He did the best he could with what he had, and so somebody could flip this around and do it from Lee's side, and not me. I don't like getting put myself in Lee's shoes. But if you stick around it from Meade's side, one person's side, you get an idea of the way you have to. You're trying to do that sort of command capability of anticipation of what the enemy might do. And it's a really important kind of factor in this. So yeah, the one side of this. I see the other thing I would add to it is, one of the things that Meade brings to it, and this goes to that point about echelon really mattering. Since he was a corps commander, he understood how corps operated. And so, as the field army commander, and, previously he didn't have much of a feel as a corps commander about what was going on in the other corps. There wasn't like Hooker's command style. Meade does a better job of that, of letting his corps know where the other corps are. That's a really important thing. And he has an expectation of how far a corps could march, what they need to be able to do to get ready for battle, all of those things. And so he brings that perspective. And then Mitchell mentioned it too. One of the things that's we found kind of fascinating on this, the artillery reserve and the headquarters, represent a significant marching formation for him. They have to move too. He has to count them and think about them. Right. And on the flip side, he also knows that Lee has, and that's never, the artillery reserve is never depicted on maps. That is a separate thing. The headquarters is never depicted on maps as a separate thing that takes up, 5 miles of road or whatever it might take up. And specifically, it's something like that, right? 5, 6, 7 miles of road, maybe a little bit more in certain cases. He's also looking at the enemy and knowing, what his formations will take up on a road. Like he's aware of that, right? So that's part of his, like it doesn't matter what, exactly what Lee does. Those Lee's formations are going to take up a certain amount of space on the road. And so he's thinking that way as he goes. So that's part of his perspective too.
And if I can just hop onto this too, I think one thing that bears mentioning, and Tom hit on it briefly in his kind of aside about, well, how do you tell both sides of a campaign? We've chosen to fixate on Meade's perspective very deliberately. But part of the project too grew from the orientation that was baked into a lot of staff ride programming, even at the War College, given its geography and its location. And of course, so much of the campaign centered around Carlisle in its early stages. But of course, that's only because Confederate forces were there and then marched south to the battlefield, the ultimate battlefield at Gettysburg from the north. And so one of the drivers of this project was, and Tom and I drove all the roads and got down into Maryland and really tried to get a feel for all the terrain and the passes and the gaps. But we thought this will require deliberate rethink to try to put ourselves in Meade's headspace, to see the campaign with his eyes, and not really to jump into any kind of conversation or experiential learning staff ride modality at Gettysburg automatically from the perspective of Confederate forces, which, given Carlyle's geography, that's quite natural.
Well, pick a moment or like an important dilemma or decision, say, that Meade faced in the days leading up to the battle, and just give me an example of what you're talking about. How did standing on the spot inform your understanding of a particular important moment?
Yeah, so I think you see a lot of this with the terrain set that is South Mountain, which to kind of the uninformed or to a casual reader might suggest it's a single hill or a single mountain feature, but it's actually an extension, a range, so to speak. And of course, in that are numerous passes or gaps, right? And both Meade and kind of his top lieutenants in the lead up to the battle understood that Lee faced a very unique kind of operational problem, which was that he had a vast preponderance of his forces, namely the First Corps under Longstreet, that was still in the valley and had to get out of the valley somehow, right? It would have to cross that range. And there were only so many places to do this, right? And so in the lead up to the fight, Meade and Reynolds in particular are wondering, okay, where are Confederate forces going to exit South Mountain? Where are they going to pop out? Because that's the only way they'll be useful. And one pass in particular, the Monterey Pass, was of keen importance to Reynolds in particular and to Meade, and it's something they talk about and would talk about. It's probably not the right word, but if you read their dispatches and their orders and their correspondence, you can quickly perceive that they were fearful in some sense, really up to about the 30th of June, that Confederate forces would exit the valley to their south, kind of and left, and threaten the Army of the Potomac from that position. Of course, in the hours kind of leading up to the fight, it becomes apparent that Lee, for reasons that Meade found inexplicable, and Reynolds too, did not want to use that pass. And he could have used that basically to access Fairfield and Emmitsburg, and that would have given him more options. But until you actually drive that and see that, that was a viable option for Lee's forces, and Meade was keenly aware of that, which is why he was prepared to kind of concentrate and mass there or to the south. Meade had built in options into his campaign design. But that's one example where, like, unless you actually drive the roads and see the ground and understand kind of the dilemmas and the implications of those for concentration of forces in time and space, that's a detail that you might just gloss over in reading, say, Sears or Coddington, or classic campaign histories of the sort.
And I would add to this too that to give people maybe a visualization of what we're talking about, the Appalachian Trail runs along this South Mountain, and it crosses it. And, so if anybody's you can imagine a mountain trail, and, you're in single file line, kind of, having to cross this thing. If you're going over the mountain and not through a pass, and now imagine putting, a large, formation of troops in this, tens of thousands of troops trying, wagons. Like, you're not using the Appalachian Trail to go through this, right? So you absolutely have to use these passes. And the point about the passes is even those are kind of suboptimal if you're going through a single one, because you end up with having a column that's 30 miles long. And if you kind of, like, as a planning factor, if you're visualizing this like an Army commander does, you think, something that's troops can march 12 miles a day normally. If you accelerate that, it gets something like 20. Sometimes you can do a little bit better than that. And so if you're strung out on this thing, by the time, the guys in the rear of that column, get to the fight, the fight's already over, kind of thing. And this is what Meade's looking at. This is why when Mitch was talking about the South Mountain, with the South Mountain Range, which is on the east side of the Shenandoah and then Cumberland Valley, where Lee's army is, that's the route they take north to invade Pennsylvania. You kind of understand that this mountain range has just a few passes in it that are vitally important. And this is what Meade is really looking at. And again, it's like sort of fun to say this to you. Like, we can't emphasize this point enough about, switching the perspective there is a tendency for us to go to go to the Gettysburg battle, and you see it in the movie, right? In the Gettysburg movie, the first stand is up on this Chambersburg Road, which goes towards the Cashtown Gap, one of the passes we're talking about. And, it's John Buford and, played by Sam Elliott. And he's talking about the high ground and everybody's all excited about him. And you kind of forget, and you get in the Gettysburg movie, which is a reflection of like how the staff rides are. Meade doesn't barely appears, either in the book Killer Angels. And there are very few studies have actually looked at it really close from the perspective of Meade. It's all like Lee's decisions, and if you're the lost cause types, it tends to be, how Lee's generals let him down. Jeb Stuart wasn't there. He's off on his ride around Meade's army. Ewell doesn't attack fast enough. So it's always somebody else. A.P. Hill is one of his corps commanders is sick and kind of seems to be out of the fight. Longstreet's buried back at Chambersburg. So one of the things we ended up kind of, when you looked at it from Meade's perspective, and Mitchell mentioned this, the stuff that's kind of inexplicable to him about how Lee's operating is actually like a pretty good indication of Lee not being very good in this campaign. And the major mistakes that they make are his, that the Confederates make, rebels are his, not Stuart's, not Ewell's, not Longstreet's, not Hill's. They're all things that in fact, one of the things that comes out of this, if there's we're not looking for heroes on the rebel side on this, we want the good guys to win. But, if you're looking at this, one of the heroes for the Confederate side, the only reason they're even in the fight is because Ewell does really, really well in reconcentrating his troops back way faster than Meade, expects. And if Longstreet had done a march as fast as Ewell does, and Lee had sent him down to Emmetsburg, in the Emmetsburg direction, either through the Monterey Pass or on the roads on the east side of the mountain, if he had done either of those things, they could, and they marched as fast as Ewell, the Army of the Potomac would have had to get out of there. They would have never been able to fight the Battle of Gettysburg. It probably would have been somewhere else.
So just, I don't want to spend the whole episode on Gettysburg, but this is interesting. So the whole logic, right, of the Eastern theater of the war is, you have this big valley to the west of the mountains that the Confederates can go up and down. The Union can go up and down too, but the Confederates typically use as an invasion route. And then that's on a sort of north-south, but sort of curving axis up the coast. And then you have rivers going roughly east-west that are barriers to movement as you go north-south. And those two features in combination are the natural features that sort of define the campaigns. And I guess each pass that you come through on this campaign, the Gettysburg campaign, would be an indicator of Lee's intentions, right? So what does Meade think Lee's most likely intentions are? And you characterize it as a mistake coming through the passes he comes through. What is the nature of the mistake or mistakes?
Well, I think you have to think of it in terms of this is a really important thing about the Civil War that I'm not sure a lot of that is like gotten into the popular imagination as much. I think historians somewhat know it. A lot of military observers understand this, but it's really important to understand that Robert E. Lee is, thinks of fighting in very Napoleonic terms. He's looking for a decisive battle, right? And so how do you get to a decisive battle? One of the ways to do this is to threaten key strategic points, something like capitals, important cities. Obviously, Washington, D.C. is one of them. Baltimore could be one, Harrisburg, maybe even Philadelphia. But by threatening them, this forces the enemy out into the open. You find a place to fight. And this is the interesting thing with Lee, is that he seems to be more about, he doesn't really care that much about getting to the battlefield in a position of advantage as much as just getting to a battlefield, finding a place where they'll settle down and he can fight them and he'll find a place to fight. He's not so great on the offensive about these ways. Now, he's also trying to gather resources along the way, and that's important to this campaign, because it is the breadbasket, and he wants to come up into Pennsylvania because the Virginia side of it's getting a little depleted, right? So that's part of what he's doing on this. But he's still looking for a decisive battle. And one of the interesting things about the Civil War, and I think Meade is starting to understand this. Grant gets it the best. General Grant gets it the best, is that there's no such thing as a decisive battle anymore. The armies that are organized into corps that are made up of combined arms corps are extremely difficult to destroy in a single day. This is why Grant's Overland campaign is so important the next year, where he grinds them, and where the very definition of campaign changes from a maneuver to a decisive battle or an important battle to a series of battles, the way we kind of think about it now. But in this case, this is, I think Meade is also thinking in terms of like, I can win a big battle. I'm not sure if it'll be decisive, but I can win a big battle. But Meade is very much focused, unlike Lee, on how he maneuvers his army on the campaign will will give him a position of advantage when the battle comes. Like I said, Lee just sort of like, hey, wherever they're at, we'll find it. Wherever they're at, we'll fix them. We'll find a flank. We'll roll them up on each other, and we'll win. Plus my guys are their morale is high. They're undefeated. They can do great things. And the Army of the Potomac's morale is low. And that's not actually true in this case, but that's kind of the way it goes.
And so his final decisions there, right before the meeting engagement on the 1st, indicate what exactly? I suppose that's what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, so it's kind of unclear, right? This is the in his case, that's the kind of strange thing. He doesn't seem to be, when he gets word that the Army of the Potomac is moving north faster than he anticipated, he gives an order for his guys to concentrate back, and to Ewell's corps is split. They've headed out towards the Susquehanna River, and he calls them back, and Ewell does follow these orders, but he's kind of unclear. We're going to concentrate around Gettysburg, maybe Cashtown, and this order would back them up against the mountain, maybe give them a route in or out through the Cashtown Gap, but it's not exactly clear. And I think it's, and this is why they kind of, the Confederates and the apologists tend to bang on about Stuart not being there, his cavalry. He didn't have his eyes. He doesn't know where they're at. He's confused about this stuff. But given the information he had, he still could have made some different decisions about what he's trying to do. It's not really clear if he wants to concentrate in the outside of the valley and then fight a battle there, or retreat back into the valley and fight a battle. Maybe you'll go back, bring the resources back, and get the Federals to attack him. It's kind of strange, and this is that dispute he has with Longstreet, with his First Corps commander, who says, I thought the idea was for us to go north, invade, find good defensive ground where we've been successful in the past, get them to engage with us, and then we counterattack on favorable ground. And Lee's kind of all over the place with this. And like we said, he's kind of saved by Ewell coming back as fast as he does, because as it turns out, he kind of feeds A.P. Hill's corps in piecemeal.
And I think this ambiguity, if I can interject here, has its roots really all the way in kind of the strategical concept, for the campaign. Like in May, there's really not a clear, Lee and Davis and Seddon, the Confederate Secretary of War, they meet a couple times in May. And of course, they're talking about the basic strategic dilemma, which is, do we try to relieve Vicksburg, or is that even feasible or not? And of course, the die is cast for a second Northern campaign, but there really aren't clear minutes of the decision-making that went into that. And there also is not a very clear documentary record of what Longstreet and Lee actually discussed on the eve of the campaign itself. So I think that ambiguity of Lee's design, it's rooted in a much kind of bigger ambiguity that has its roots all the way back in May, before the campaign even kicks off.
So in other words, we're going to go north. We're going to threaten things they care about, specifics TBD. And at some point, we're going to force a battle. And it seems like a lot of things were still TBD at the moment the battle was actually met. Is that fair?
I think that's right.
Yeah. So much so that from Meade's perspective, he can't really understand what Lee's doing, because it doesn't actually make much sense, because it is all TBD. That's a good way of putting it. And in the article, we come up with two maps sort of to show the visualization of like the different options that Meade thinks that Lee's going to do. Yeah. The two basic options that he has at the point, and Lee kind of does neither or both kind of poorly, and it ends up kind of confusing Meade about like what's actually happening. And then his eyes and ears, Reynolds is actually killed on the first day, which confuses things more. So it takes a minute for them to kind of catch up. But in the meantime, though, Meade has, unlike Lee, Meade has a very clear idea about what he wants, what he's supposed to do. Hey, protect Baltimore, protect Washington, D.C., go engage them in battle, and defeat them in battle, kick them out of Pennsylvania. If you can defeat them all together, that would be great. Kind of idea in this.
Assume the tactical offense or defense, right? Like those options are built into his approach.
Reynolds is by far the best character to play in any Gettysburg staff ride. You show up, you
shorter prep,
and you get to enjoy the rest of the day. You get to enjoy everybody else's presentations. So one last question about this, and then we'll step back to the broader project you guys are working on. But so okay, fine. Lee is kind of operating with so much ambiguity. It seems ambiguous even to Lee this leads to failure to concentrate effectively in a place where he'll actually have an advantage in the battle to come. But none of that necessarily leads to, I mean, everything we've just said doesn't necessarily lead to Meade being in an advantageous position. What does Meade do well, or how does Meade get lucky, or both, such that he does end up in an advantageous position?
So first things first, he moves his base of supply to Westminster early on, which kind of shifts his options to the east, gives him more protection. He's arrayed his infantry corps in positions to approach a point of concentration like Gettysburg on as many as 4 or 5 different avenues of approach. Tom's point at the beginning of moving forces, large echelon forces like a corps, some 9,000 to 13,000 men. These take up 10 miles of road space apiece, and then you think of all their enablers, their guns. So that space is really critical. And the Army of the Potomac, all told, with all of its pieces, right? It's fires, it's enablers, it's infantry, it's cav. I mean, it requires more than 100 miles of road space. So the fact that Meade is able to kind of create physical spatial dimensions for his design is really critical. So I would start there. Tom, I don't know what you would want to add to that.
Yeah, so there's an anticipation thing. So a part of this too is, unlike, I don't think Lee ever does this in the campaign. Meade anticipates that the fight is coming, and so those big kind of ponderous corps, and the Army of the Potomac corps are smaller, but there's more of them. So that's so it's a similar type problem. The big ponderous corps that take up a lot of road space, he has them all drop. He gives them the order to drop all of their extra accoutrements, basically their camp gear, and he has it sent back to that back towards the base of supply, so they can march faster because he anticipates fight coming. And so they're all marching on parallel roads. They're all within a day's march of each other. And this is very important. So that at whatever point, this kind of like large square formation that they're in, it's like a diamond is the best way to look at it. Whatever point of the diamond encounters the enemy, the other ones are able to come in to support rapidly. And he does this like very, very clearly. One of the things that's we talk about this a lot, so everybody gets, you jump into the battle, everybody likes to start jumping into the battle and start talking about a lot of the tactics of the fighting, and that's like less interesting to us these days, because there's just not that many equivalent ideas for what we do these days. So that is less important, but the ability to disperse and concentrate, I know on your show, you've probably talked about this with the Pacific and things like this. Is this constant dilemma. You have mass formations. How do you disperse and concentrate, for a battle? And this is what Meade does very, very well. And Lee doesn't do particularly well in this fight. And this gives him an advantage in this fight. So like we could talk about all the there's a million different tactical actions, obviously, in the Gettysburg fight, in the battle itself. And, in many cases, the Army of the Potomac comes off the worst in those little tactical actions. You could talk about sickles, you could talk about all the stuff, right? There's a million of them in there. But and we talk all the time about how the best tactics in the world can't overcome bad operational art or bad strategy. But in this case, you sort of see the opposite. We get to probably show something where good operational art, good strategy, what they called at the time, overcomes like all of those sort of tactical shortfalls that they have in the Army of the Potomac. In fact, this actually could be an argument about like one of the things that the United States Army, that the American way of war is really built around, is an ability to be overwhelming strategically and with your operational art. Getting those guys concentrated in the right place at the right time, with durable formations that are able to keep fighting and sustain in a fight. This is what we're very good at, even when we have untrained troops or guys with low morale or, some poor tactical leaders because they're inexperienced and, they haven't earned it yet, or they're wounded, whatever it might be. This is what one of the major points of this is this ability to do strategy, operational art better, gives you an advantage that you really should be seeking, as you're trying to improve your tactical capabilities over time. You see it again and again. World War I, World War II happens over and over again.
That's really interesting. So here's the sort of $100 question I think you guys are asking yourselves in the context of this project, which is, okay, so we have the maps. Maps just don't really help. The maps that exist don't really help us that much to understand the operational level decision making. They do an okay-ish job of tactics and showing the tactical situations of the day, but in at least 2 grounds they fail. for understanding operational level decision making. One, they're not very good at communicating optionality and the range of potential futures out of any given moment. And two, we just recorded a really interesting conversation with Alexander Burns about his book about 18th century warfare, which he calls Infantry in Battle, and a nod to the great post-World War I American manual of infantry combat. The main theme of which, of course, is reality is a little bit different from theory. And so problem two is the reality of moving, in this case, these massive corps with all of their accoutrements down the road. Like, that's a big deal. Like, that's a major factor, and the maps do nothing to help you understand the logistical challenges, literally physical challenges of moving this stuff. Even though it's really not that complicated of a thing to understand on one level, anybody who's been in a traffic jam could kind of get what the issues are. So right. those two things kind of hold back even an understanding of as comparatively simple a situation as the lead up to the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, which I say comparatively simple. There's no air dimension. There's certainly no cyber dimension. There's
right.
none of it. It's really just troops and horses and their equipment and their artillery on the ground moving around. Today in 2025, the situation is substantially more complicated. And if our visualizations, such as they are coming up short and helping us understand things that happened in 1863, how on earth are we going to use visuals to understand the battlefield or the operational theater, or however you want to characterize it, in 2025? Is that the main one? Is that your question? And two, what are your first stabs at answering it?
Yeah, I think it's vitally important. You know, if listeners, know us a little bit, we're kind of on the record for saying that we need to be focused more on warfighting issues, especially in the military. We tend to drift into policy a lot, policy making for some good reason, where, security policy, it's defense policy. So we kind of drift into that stuff. And there's like a kind of image that this, that fighting is just sort of big tactics. And so, hey, they already know enough about this stuff, but it's a different way of looking at things. Right. And one of the sort of, we chose a relatively straightforward, like you said, it's basically in one domain, but there's like little things in this that are sort of showing some other domains. When we talk about that move from the base of supply to Westminster, like the idea of that is that, the Westminster's on a rail line that's connected to Baltimore, which is a port, right? And is also connected to rail lines to the main supply depot for the United States, for the Army of the Potomac, which is around Washington, D.C. Right. So and their ability to, ships carry way more stuff than trains, but so if you can load up lots of stuff off of ships, and trains carry more stuff than wagons, so you start thinking this way. And American military leaders, when they were really focused on these issues of large scale command after the Civil War, for them, they take these lessons, and they use them. It's like one of their great sort of heartbreaks in World War I is they can't use the Navy more, right? Because where they're at in the theater, there's just no way to get ships there. Even, for resupply purposes and all of that, but that is that sort of consistent dilemma. It's, sort of joint expeditionary operations. And how do we visualize those things? And you start to see we're just showing a start of this here. You could do a similar type of maps for the Overland Campaign, where you do have more, in 1864, 65, where you do have more, where they're using the Navy and maritime support a lot more clearly. It wouldn't be that hard to sort of start depicting, where you put your air bases, how close they have to be. There's a mix of that stuff, then you start depicting the protection of them, and what you're using them for, both resupply and then for fires, the deeper fight, how you would depict that stuff. But this kind of main problem, of moving forces on multiple, large formations on multiple roads is a persistent one, even in that domain, because a lot of the other domains, hey, look, we work for the Army, so we tend to be, the ground fight matters, right? The ground fight is, a lot of, I won't say that all of them everybody else is in support, but in their complementary way, at some point you're going to have to fight on the ground, and you're going to have to do certain things on the ground. And it's going to be human beings going through terrain, moving in large formations. And we saw this, we see this in Ukraine, right? We see this with the Russians in the Ukraine. Like, one of the things you could make one of the points you could make is that, the Russians ended up in, if this sounds familiar, they ended up in very long, ponderous columns on not very good roads, and trying to move large formations when in their initial invasion. And that got them in a lot of trouble, right? They kind of made the same sort of similar kind of Lee mistakes, so if we're going to learn from these things, there's ways to depict this differently, to visualize it differently. You can add in those other domains. I'm not sure exactly how the cyber would go into that, but you can add in some of these other domains, along the way. and start figuring it out. So like we really wanted this as a start, not as a finish, but to sort of indicate there are ways to talk about war fighting that's, the business of senior military officers, and almost exclusively their business, right? Not in a discussion, the civil relations discussion, but exclusive their business of moving and fighting large formations, joint, combined in war. And this is like, we see this as kind of a start of showing this using a campaign a lot of people are familiar with. And that, and in doing this, we were able to, create insights, about this campaign that, some people have maybe intuited, but haven't really, explored it fully. Yeah. And then some of those things kind of come out in this article, we hope.
Yeah, no, it seems like a really worthy project. And my last question, I'm sort of struggling how to formulate it, but, just thinking about the present day and thinking about an effort to visualize, say, a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, or the Suwalki Gap, or whatever battle. It's probably going to be someplace that we don't predict, but some likely spot of a clash, and thinking about how to create the visualization in such a way as to help a commander in their own mind then have a correct or the best possible estimate of his options, the bad guy's options, the likely futures. What are the elements that need to go into those visuals that you think are missing? One is kind of a practical question, and then two, a much harder question to answer. I mean, it seems to me a much harder question to answer is, it's only the visuals are only ever going to get you so far. At the end of the day, the maps are never going to be reality. They can't be. So what do you need to do in terms of educating and preparing the commander so that he can achieve, or she can achieve, that visualization of the battlefield that, Clausewitz, that scene at a stroke that is the commander's art, that the map will never do for you. A good map will help you, but it will never do for you.
So there's two answers to this. So in terms of your first question, right? So the visualization of stuff, so we see this as a start, right? We were able to sort of put things on there, things like bases of supply, which we call it here. It could be supply depots, could be other names, putting those on there, understanding how you visualize bases of operations, visualizing, depicting formations as they actually are, as the amount of space they take up on roads and off roads, and sort of depicting it that way, all of those things, and then also doing your sort of best estimate of what the enemy's things might look like that way too, right? That was like a key aspect of it is you're given the information that we have, that the commander has, both when you're studying a historical thing, instead of like guessing what the other, knowing what the other side has and depicting it that way, saying like, well, how did Meade in this case understand that? How did Eisenhower understand it? How did Patton understand it in their fight? And all of those things. To your other question about how do we help people in the future get to this, develop that, CUDI, right? The sort of this visualization of it.
I can never pronounce it right, so that's why I kind of translated it.
Yeah, I'm guessing too. It's French, so I'm sure I did it wrong. That's how I've heard it. Yeah, I think there's two things that really matter here. So one is that warfare, even in this era, and you can kind of see this with Meade and Reynolds' relationship, and some of the other guys that are in his that work with him, is that this is in the modern era become much more of a collective effort, right? So instead of waiting around for a genius to show up, who can do those things, we make staffs who can sort of approximate genius collectively, right? And so how they work together and how they put together an estimate to help a commander's decision making is really, really important. And that's why we have these big staffs, and we should never lose sight of that. We have a tendency to have people like, oh, that guy's the intelligence officer. That's not really what his role is. We say a G2 or a J2, they're the intelligence officer. That's not what his role is. His role is assistant chief of staff or deputy chief of staff for intelligence. And if you think about what a chief of staff does, we tend to say they run a staff. No, a chief of staff thinks like the commander, anticipates the commander and runs the staff to support the commander. So an assistant chief of staff is also thinking like a commander, but would say an emphasis on intelligence or an emphasis on operation or an emphasis on logistics. So they're all thinking that way, right? And then so how do we develop, both commanders and staffs, senior staffs who can do those things? Well, I'm a historian, so I would say this way is like, look at a bunch of examples, put yourself in their shoes. You're never going to see the exact same problem, but when you see a lot of like type problems, you develop the ability to anticipate what's happening better, right? You use those examples over and over again, whether it's through historical examples that you study, you put yourself in the shoes of those people honestly. That's why we're supposed to do staff rides. That's why we study historical ones, why we write about them. It's what the war colleges and the command general staff colleges did historically, and we do a little bit less of now, and hopefully we get back to doing more of it. You put yourself in those shoes, and then you do novel war games, exercises, field exercises, map exercises, computerized war games these days. Put yourself in those situations over and over again until it becomes a little bit more second nature. And then maybe, some geniuses pop out of that, and they're very good at that at a glance, seeing the thing and making the decision and understanding what's going on very quickly. But really that at a glance thing, there's really no such thing as a gut instinct. It's, that's a whole bunch of, it's what one guy calls, Gary Klein, maybe you've had him around, he calls recognition prime decision making. It's the recognition is seeing it a bunch of times, and then it primes your decision making, and it feels like a gut feeling, but it's really a whole bunch of examples kind of playing out, and you sort of see a similar situation and are able to anticipate what's happening and make smarter decisions on it. Because we have a tendency to believe that like perfect intelligence leads to perfect decision making, but you could have an absolutely clear picture of where everything is and still make the wrong call, right?
Yeah.
So.
It's really fascinating and kind of merits, we're almost out of time, but it sort of merits a whole separate or continuing discussion, because based on my own very limited experience, and I never ascended to the ranks of the field grade before departing back to civilian life, but in what experience I did have, the challenge with all these processes, right, is that I take your point. You're creating the sort of staff processes to kind of approximate in a group what a genius might in theory be able to do on their own. But the problem is, as you get into the process of the processes, you sort of check the boxes of the process. And if you get to the last box and you've checked it, you feel like you've done your job. But the process itself is never going to encapsulate or really be able to account for the full crazy fluidity of reality. And so the danger to the individuals is that they're going to lose that instinct or spark or creativity that actually allows you to understand the battlefield as it is, or it might actually be. That is to say, there has to be this human creative element working its way through the process that's not smooshed by the process to get the good results that you want. And maybe you never even know that you have a problem, because in the American military, our experience for some time now has been against enemies who are generally tactically quite inferior, at least in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So your process may not, the weaknesses of your process may never become apparent to you, but the day you actually face an enemy that's on par with you or near par with you, I feel like the problems are going to come quickly to the fore.
Yeah, I think you've hit on something really important. We were talking offline a little bit about the idea of the role that the institutions have in developing doctrine. And so I'll give you an example that relates to exactly what you're talking about. Doctrine. So we follow this path that you're talking about, that we're talking about here. The doctrine right now generally tends to, it talks about command, and it talks about, planning process, military decision-making process, the joint planning process, and they're kind of separate. And I think that's a mistake. And it's something we can correct in doctrine and start having people thinking about. So pretty much every service has something like a commander's way of looking at the problem, which is understand, visualize, describe, direct, lead, assess, something like that, right? Understand it, visualize it, describe it, direct, make the decision, lead, assess. And that process tends to be too separated from the various steps that you're talking about, box checking that goes on in like a military decision making or joint planning process. And we really need to I always say this, instead of saying mission analysis, we should talk about mission synthesis, right? So it's like these times where they come together and you get more and more of the staff putting themselves in the shoes of the decision the commander has to make. And there is never going to be a time where that is a purely math problem. Sometimes we talk about these decision matrices that these guys make, and it's like if they all add up, then the decision is made. No, it just doesn't work that way. And you can't think that way. We try to over science, over reason the military decision making. Doesn't really work that way. Like you said, there is going to be some kind of gut instinct on this, and like I said, I think the only way kind of around that is to, there's a tendency for people who are not in a command track, or say they're in a support or supply thing, to say like, it's not my job to think that way. I'm not doing Patton stuff, so I don't need to think like Patton. I think that's dead wrong. I think like everybody needs to think about how the fight works, right? Now, like you said, we could talk about this forever. I have lots of examples, and it's at all different levels and at all different sort of echelons where that's really, really important, where the supply guys need to understand how the fight works, and the fighting guys need to know how the supply works, right? How the mobilization stuff works. You have to know all of these, at least have some familiarity with all of these, and you're going to be supported by guys who know it in more detail, but everybody needs to know what they're all talking about, right? And so I think you're onto something about this, about this point, and it's like, hey, we're working on it. I mean, like I say, the good thing is that the American military has been dealing with sort of joint expeditionary warfare at a scale, a degree that like nobody else has, and we're still struggling with it. So where do we think like the new guys, how they're going to do with it? Yep. Who haven't been doing amphibious attacks since the Mexican War.
Tom Bruscino, Mitchell Klingenberg, really interesting conversation. I really appreciate you guys making the time.
Thank you for having us.
Aaron, thanks for having us.
This is a Nebulous Media production. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.